Hanging in the gallery are two landscape images by Canadian artists. They share a similar palette or color scheme, with shades of white and off-white, with some darker tones and only a few other colors. Both images seem very still and quiet, and both offer us a perspective on the idea of industry that can be said to be specific to the time in which they were created. But the similarities end there. One image is by A.Y. Jackson, a member of the Group of Seven, which we will talk about more in a moment, and the other is this photograph by Edward Burtynsky. When you see this photograph in person, it is hard not to be impressed. It is quite large, and the closer that you get, the more tiny details you can see. Take a moment to pause the video here and talk about what you see. What is the place, and what is happening? What clues can you see in the picture? What questions do you have? And what are the feelings that you have when you look at this landscape? When I talk to classes about this photograph in the gallery, the first things that I often hear are that this is a winter landscape with a big mountain in the background. Then we can talk about the fact that there are no buildings or other signs of people. At first glance, this seems like a pretty reasonable thing to say, but then we look a little bit closer. Do the trees look like they've lost their leaves for the winter, or do they look like they're dead? Can you see the black pipes that are scattered around the scene? There are some on the right side near the middle of the photograph, and on the left side just down from the rocks. And it looks like there's a pipeline coming down the hill on the right as well. What do you think that means? Edward Burtynsky is a photographer who uses his work to show us the terrible impact that industry has on the landscape it occupies and on the environment as a whole. His interest is in photographing the landscape as it is transformed by industry. This particular work shows the environmental aftermath of mining and processing metals from the earth. The place pictured here is Elliott Lake in Ontario, and the photo was taken in 1995. In 1954, uranium was discovered near Elliott Lake. Uranium tailings are the waste that's left over after uranium is mined and processed for use in nuclear reactors and other uses. The majority of uranium tailings in Canada, about 200 million tons, are located in Elliott Lake. This wall of radioactive sand, 10 meters high, holds back a lake of similar material left over from the now closed uranium mining operation. This material will remain dangerously radioactive for hundreds of thousands of years, risking environmental contamination and significant health dangers. In contrast to that terrible scene, we see A.Y. Jackson's small painted landscape sketch from about 1910. It shows the Montreal harbor. What do you see in this scene? How does this painting make you feel? How do you think the artist felt about the industrial activity we see pictured in the background? Montreal experienced one of the strongest periods of growth in its history between the end of the 19th century and the start of the First World War. You can see some large buildings and perhaps some suggestion of industry along the waterfront in the distance. Interestingly, the artist has left this growth and development in the distance, instead showing a quiet shoreline with some signs of an earlier time. The objects in the foreground may be a wooden wagon or a cart. When we look at an artwork and try and figure out what the artist is telling us, it is important to remember that every single detail, every color, and everything that is left out is the result of a choice made by the artist. Every choice adds to the meaning or message of the work. Edward Burtynsky chose to make a huge photograph that shows us every detail of the destruction of the landscape. The impact is strong. His message is clear. He wants us to know how bad it is. A.Y. Jackson, on the other hand, is a bit more gentle. His industry is in the distance, and it doesn't seem to be affecting him much in this painting. Perhaps this means he is uninterested or unconcerned by the industrial growth that is happening. Remember, in 1910, concerns for nature and the environment were not something that most people thought about. Or perhaps he does offer us something to think about. By placing more traditional tools like the cart in the foreground and the industry in the back, perhaps he is purposely contrasting the old and the new, the past and the progress that is happening in front of him. What do you think? In another painting of industry, we see Joseph Sidney Hallam's Steel Company Hamilton from 1953. Take a look at this work and talk about what you see. How do you feel seeing this painting? And how do you think the artist felt about industry? I am not certain that this artist had a message for the viewers in the same way that Bratinsky does, but I do know that the way that people thought about industry and the environment in 1953 was very different than it is today. When I talk about this painting with students, often the first reaction is to talk about pollution and dirty factories. This fits very much with our beliefs today, but when I look more closely, I don't think the artist necessarily shared this point of view. Let's take a look at the picture and see what we can find out. The industrial buildings are huge and take up most of the picture. Often when an artist uses something in this manner, they're showing power and strength. This is also very different than the Bratinsky work, which shows signs of human activity as very, very small details in a very large landscape. His interest is showing large-scale impact made by smaller signs of industry. And yes, the building is brown, which many people think of as dirty, but perhaps this is just the color the building actually was. What I notice most is that the sky is a beautiful blue with fluffy white clouds. It looks like a lovely day, and that makes most people feel pretty good. Also, there is no sign of smoke or pollution, which you would think he would include if he thought badly about those factories. He would be sure to show the harm they cause if that was his concern. If we look back in time to when this painting was made, we may understand these choices. In Hamilton in the 1950s, there was what was known as a post-war boom. This means after World War II ended, industry and other activity grew quickly. It was a time of prosperity. Because of this, there was a lot of demand for steel for cars and other products. The steel companies grew very quickly, which meant more jobs and more money for the community. This means that this factory was a very good thing for the city. Whether we are looking back at images of industry from many years ago, or at frightening scenes of the impact of industry today, the time and place in which the images were made is important to think about. The way people think today is often very different than the way they thought about issues in the past. We can learn from these differences, and they can help us to see the cause and consequences of certain actions and lifestyles. Edward Bratinsky is an artist with a complicated message. He uses his work to expose the devastation that large-scale industry causes in the natural world. But at the same time, he understands that the lifestyles we choose to live are one of the biggest factors in this existence. His photographs are at once beautiful and terrifying. When talking about his work, he says, "These images are metaphors to the dilemma of our modern existence. We are drawn by desire, a chance at good living, yet we are consciously or unconsciously aware that the world is suffering for our success. Our dependence on nature to provide materials for our consumption and our concern for the health of our planet sets us into an uneasy contradiction. For me, these images function as reflecting pools of our times." He also reminds us that we come from nature. There is an importance to having a certain reverence for what nature is because we are connected to it. If we destroy nature, we destroy ourselves. These are very powerful words to go along with very powerful images. In each case, the works we have looked at today have a lot to teach us about the way we live and the impact that our choices have.